Hello and welcome back. It's Stephanie here, and I'm going to be creating a card that was designed by design team member Torico using products from the new December 2017 release. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a window card. So I'm going to use these jumbo peekaboo circle windows and create an opening on our card front, and then we're going to create a scene on the inside of the card. So I'm just getting the die positioned on the front of the card base, and then I'm going to open that up and run this through my die cut machine. And what I'm going to be left with is this window opening, and we have this fun kind of scallop detail along the window, and then that stitched outline along the edges of the circle. So this is going to be our window on the front of the card, and then we're going to see the scene kind of peeking through this window. Now before we move on to the inside of the card, I do want to stamp and heat emboss my sentiment on the card front. So I'm just going to use my embossing bag first and add that to the card panel. And that's just going to make sure that any of my embossing powder doesn't stick where I don't want it. I'm then going to use my mini Misty, and I'm going to line up the sentiment right underneath of that window opening. And then I'm going to stamp that with Versamark ink. And this is just a clear sticky ink that's going to allow us to add the embossing powder on top, which is white embossing powder. And then I'm going to use my heat tool to heat set that. You do want to make sure your heat tool is really hot before bringing it to your cardstock, and that will just minimize the warping that happens to the cardstock panel. So I'm just adding the white panel to the inside of the card so that I can line everything up for the stamping. So I put that in there and I've closed the card, and now I'm just going to take the Supergirl image and I'm going to figure out where I want her to show through that window, and I'm going to close my Misty to pick her up on the door there. And then once I have that done, I can open up the card and I'm going to stamp her onto that panel with some brown ink. Now it doesn't matter what ink you use here. I'm just using Craft because it happened to be on my work surface, but this is just kind of a placeholder. We're going to end up covering this up. So as long as you have any type of ink there to kind of stamp the image to use as a reference, that's all you're going to need for this part. So once I had her stamped on there, I removed the panel from the card base, and I'm going to do some stamping on here now. So I have the city landscape, and I want to heat emboss this with black, but I don't want to use black embossing powder because I tend to find it super messy. So what I prefer to do is stamp with my black licorice dye ink, and then I stamp directly over top of that with Versamark ink. So what happens is I end up with that really sticky ink over top of there, and that allows me to add the clear embossing powder over those stamped buildings. If you prefer not to have the images embossed, you can just definitely stamp them with the black ink and just leave them as is, but I really love the look of the shiny surface once they are heat embossed. And you can see there I ended up with a little smudge on the bottom, and we're going to do some stamping there with our second sentiment. So I'm just going to use my eraser here. This is a sand eraser, and you can see there I was able to erase that completely off. Then I heat set the images, and you can see here that I didn't get my buildings to meet perfectly in the center. And since we're going to see that on the finished card, I need to make sure that it kind of looks seamless. So I just took a black marker and added some color there. Now to add the background to this scene, I'm going to use some distress inks, and I've added a piece of post-it tape to the bottom portion of the card so that we don't get ink underneath of that city landscape. So what I'm doing first is I took squeezed lemonade ink and I added that all the way around the girl image. And now I'm taking some Mermaid Lagoon and I'm going to fully cover the rest of the sky with this ink. And the great thing about the yellow and the blue ink is when they meet in the middle, they kind of turn into a really nice green color and everything blends really nicely together. So I'm just going back and forth between the two colors until I get a really nice even blend and I'm happy with the look. And then I'm going to come in with some Blueprint Sketch color here and add this to the edges. And this is just going to deepen the color of the outer limits of the sky and really help to bring that yellow forward on the card and really help the girl image to stand out when we add her on top. Now to add a little bit more definition to the background, I'm taking the Radiating Ray stencil and I've laid that directly over top of my panel, and I'm using the exact same ink colors to add a little bit of ink through that stencil. And you can see we're left with that ray detail in the background, but because we've used the same colors, it's a really nice tone-on-tone look. We're also going to add some white splatter to the background. So to do that, I like to just take some white ink or paint. So this here is the Copic Opaque White ink. And I'm just putting that onto an acrylic block and mixing it with some water just to kind of thin it down a bit. And then I just like to flick it right off the edge of my acrylic block. And you can see the great splatter we get when we do it this way. It keeps it really small and kind of lets it cover the whole area without having big, huge splotches of it. So I really like applying the ink in this way. And then once I had that on there, I just removed that post-it tape. And I did end up with a little tiny bit of ink there, but I just used a white gel pen and kind of colored over top of it. And I felt like that concealed it enough. So now that we have the entire background created, I have this Supergirl image stamped onto another cardstock panel here, and this time I used Black Licorice Hybrid ink to do my stamping so that I could color her in with some Copic markers. So I'm just going to kind of speed through here and go through the coloring of her, and I'm keeping her the same color as the colors that Torico added to her, but you can definitely mix this up and change out the different colors that you use on her. So I used red for her cape and her boots, and I did miss a little part of her cape there underneath of her arms, so I will go back in a few minutes there and add that color in. And then for her dress, I'm using a few shades of blue, so I have B12, 14, and 16, just to give a really nice blend of blue color. And then I'm using some yellows for her belt across her dress, as well as the bottom and her sleeves. And then I'm going to do her skin with my basic E00 and E11 skin colors. And then I'm going to finish her off with her hair, which I've decided to color brown. And my go-to brown color palette is E55, E57, and E59. I really like those colors together to do hair. Once I had her all colored, I used the coordinating dies and die cut her. And now I have all of the different parts needed to assemble my finished card. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the inked panel to the inside area of the card base. And you just want to make sure that the white splatter you've added to that panel is completely dry before you assemble everything. So I'm just using regular adhesive here, and I'm adding this directly to the inside of the card base. And then I'm going to add adhesive to the girl image as well, and I'm going to adhere her right over top of the stamp that we have in the background. So like I mentioned earlier, that was just kind of a placeholder so we knew where to line everything up. And now we're going to cover up with the stamped image, so you'll never know that that one was kind of underneath there. So that's why it doesn't really matter what color ink you use to do that stamping. And now that I have her adhered, you can see when I close the card, we're able to see her peeking through that window. And then we have this full colorful scene on the inside. To finish it off, I stamped the secondary sentiment in the white area underneath. And now we have a completed card with the fun window detail on the front. So thank you so much to Torico for creating this card for us to recreate in today's class. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in another video soon.